Um, I think I'll let some people join in a bit. Um, Hello, Pranesh and Rohini. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, everyone who is watching it live. I'm Srinivas Kodali. I'm the moderator for today's session. We're joined with Pranesh and Rohini. Pranesh is a lawyer and a researcher, Rohini, a technologist and a researcher as well. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity, surveillance, and digital rights in India over the next 1 hour. To give a bit of background and context setting, recently the government of India, especially the DOT, Department of Telecommunications, has brought out few mandatory rules of making an app, sancharsaathi, mandatorily installed to be installed on every mobile device. And they've been also trying to make GPS on every cell phone, every mobile phone to be mandatorily always on. There are like a couple of proposals that the Department of Telecommunications is considering to improve cybersecurity to protect users from cyber fraud. But at the same time, there are concerns of surveillance and at what proportionate are these measures at all, if they are even intended for cybersecurity. So we're going to let both Pranesh and Rohini walk us through what this is. I'm hoping Pranesh can give us a background about the telecom cybersecurity rules, how they come in the context of the new act, the new Telecommunications Act, and how this, whether all of this is legal and why the state backtracked. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Srinivas. Would you like me to first speak a little bit about the legal background, or would you like me to first talk about the recent changes and the recent proposals and backtracking, etc., and then provide the
Yeah.
explanation for the background?
Let's start with what's happening now and then go back in time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So recently, there are three important notifications, or two notifications and one proposal, which are of concern. One was associated with something called sancharsaathi, which is a website, a portal, and as well as an app developed by the Department of Telecommunications. This, amongst other things, it helps you find out whether the code associated with your particular phone, what is called the IMEI numbers, which are associated with your phone, those it can help find out if it by scanning that whether it's been added to a registry as a stolen phone. It can help you in turn register something as having been stolen, and so on. This app was made mandatory to be pre-installed on all devices. There was absolutely no reason for this. I don't think this app is spyware. I don't think that was the intention or the motivation of the government, though many people question that. But it was completely unnecessary, and it was harmful by mandating software be pre-installed, which hadn't undergone security audits and so on, which asked for a number of permissions, which could later be misused potentially. And as the brouhaha around this kicked off, and within 2 days, the government backtracked and said, "Okay, given that millions of people have installed this already, thanks to the publicity, we're no longer going to require that it be mandatorily installed," which was the correct way to go about it all along. Then there's a direction on what is called SIM binding. This is a direction that applies to all what are called telecom identifier user entities. That's a bit of a mouthful, but what it essentially means is any entity out there, from your bank to WhatsApp to apps like Swiggy, etc., which use your phone number as your primary identity, as how you, for instance, log into their service and so on. Now, for a set of these, what I shall call TUIs, for a set of these TUIs, the government said that mandatorily they would need to bind their SIM, bind their app to the presence of a SIM. What that means is, say, WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal would would have to, according to the notification, continuously check for the presence of the SIM card associated with your number. And if they have a separate web-based association, then they would need to disconnect that every 6 hours. What this practically means is that the government thinks that there's less fraud happening over SMS than over WhatsApp and Signal and Telegram and so on, which all my experience shows to be otherwise. There's more fraud that happens through SMSs, and SMSs are SIM bound. SMSs are tied to your SIM identity, and SMSs can't be used unless you have your SIM placed in your phone. So somehow the government thinks the SMS model is better than the model that is currently being followed by these other messaging apps. And further, these other messaging apps do have some amount of, quote unquote, SIM binding already, meaning that you can't, for example, install WhatsApp on a new device without linking it to a SIM. You can't so on a phone you can't install WhatsApp without your SIM actually being present and being able to supply the OTP. And in order to get it on a new device, you have to have a QR code, which again provides a linkage to a SIM. So all these things are already there. It's not as though there's no verification of a phone number happening when by these services. They are already verifying, but they don't do it on a continuous basis. So you can install and then you can remove your SIM when you're, for example, traveling outside of India, put in a new SIM and continue working on the same with the same WhatsApp identity. Why this needs to be changed? Why to prevent fraud? These apps need to be made as insecure as SMSs is something that's completely unclear to me. So it's not helpful at all. And the third, which is a proposal by the COAI, which is the Association of Telecom Operators, essentially, with some additional members, but mostly run by the telecom operators. They have proposed to the government that the level of when the government comes asking telecom operators to provide location data for a particular phone number, they can provide that, but it's not super accurate. It's accurate within the scale of, say, a few dozen meters, but it's not super accurate. Now, what the telecom operators have said to the government is, you should try to make this information super accurate. And the way to do that is to mandate every phone operator provide you, that is the government, provides the government information by about the GPS location of any entity without the knowledge of the owner of the phone. So that's what they're, without any notification to the owner of the phone, etc., to tell them that they're being snooped upon. So this is a proposal that, according to a report in Reuters, is being considered by the Ministry of Home Affairs, and the Department of and the Ministry of Electronics and IT. And so far, there hasn't been a notification about this, but it's under consideration. So we see a set of new notifications and changes being proposed and considered under the new regime for telecom regulations in India, which seeks to encompass not just those things we think of as telecom operators, but all kinds of entities that use phone numbers, and greatly expands the powers of the Department of Telecom and the government. So I'll end it here. We can go a bit into the background in a bit, but I'll allow others to speak since I've been going on for long. Srinivas, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Pranesh, for setting the ground on what's been happening, what DOT has been trying to do. I'm going to ask Rohini to step in here, give a context in the sense of whether these technologies can be actually feasibly implemented, whether they will work. I mean, from your past experience and how DOT has been trying to do this in the past, or other departments have been trying to do it. Do you think this will work in terms of making things mandatory, or even using all of this to prevent cyber fraud?
So what I'm wondering after this the ground that Pranesh just laid down is, what is the threat model that's being addressed, and is it in line with the most common, the most rampant cyber fraud that happens in India and where it happens? So in like India is the source and destination of significant amounts of cyber scams and frauds, but this entire spate of measures, is it in line with the most significant model? Because this is very high friction for legitimate users. It is very high friction for businesses. For anybody who comes under the ambit of the TUIE, it will raise cost of business. It will it will disrupt workflows. So is it proportionate? Uh, and does it address the most significant, the forms of fraud? Like, is that the threat model that they have come up with? And we don't know, because this was done without any consultation. Who demanded this? Will this work? We don't know, because if you see the definition of a TUIE, that's also quite broad. They've listed some messaging apps. It's also not clear what was the logic for choosing just those apps. I don't have the figures at hand, but I'm assuming WhatsApp being a very commonplace, very ubiquitous in India. That is where most of fraudulent links are happening. Although personally on Tel have seen a bit of scammy group. Like, is this? Are you all able to hear me?
We lost you there for a minute. Can you just repeat that? Yeah.
Yeah, I am traveling and I'm not on a very good connection, so I'm going to turn off my video in the interest of you all being able to hear me. The like that the robust purpose limitation or data minimization. So I would like need to see more information, and I definitely have questions about proportionality of the obligations of the entities, where telecom identifies as supplementary, and like what can be done about that vast population which does not have the digital literacy, does not have the skills, the know-how, the resources, uh, and which are quite often the most vulnerable and the marginalized people who will be badly affected by this.
Thank you, Rohini. I'm just going to pose a different question to both of you again. So, like the context that we see all these rules coming in is also the increase in cyber fraud, right? Like WhatsApp is where all these digital arrests are happening. So, like, there is inherent fear among people about policing, about surveillance, about being wrongfully being caught up in the system and not being to escape, which is what is leading to all of these digital frauds and arrests where somebody poses as a cop or a customs officers or ED, right? It's actually the fear of the state that's allowing a lot of this fraud to happen. But we are witnessing what the state is doing to address is to increase further measures that increase this fear. It's not trying to address root causes of why this fraud is happening, right? Do you think these measures help address it somewhere, or do you think we should look at other measures? And also, I want you to slightly touch upon the issue of identifiers and identification, right? The whole digital India model is kind of based on it everywhere, and we see the other model kind of now coming into the telecom sector. So up to you guys. Yeah.
Sure, I can address some of that first. Um, there are a few changes proposed in the 2025 notifications, which could actually be helpful, but there are many more flaws in how it goes about it. So to address some of that, one thing which is actually useful is an obligation on telecom companies to, and which may be extended to these TUIs as well, to these non-telecom entities which are using phone numbers like banks and so on, and is an immediate suspension of phone numbers. So when the government tells any of these entities, these telecom entities, to actually suspend the number, then now they are under an obligation to immediately suspend the number. This was already happening. There's a system called EIR, which is being coordinated, which is a system baked into GSM, which is the technology we're mostly using, and for identifying, for blacklisting and so on, certain IMEI numbers. And there's a centrally operated CEIR, which is run by the government. Now, these, I think, are good efforts to actually reduce fraud, because it allows for specific numbers to be blacklisted. And now the power to do that is also provided. However, there are no obligations which are put on the government in this respect. So the obligations are all put on these operators, on these telecom entities. So the government has not imposed on itself any obligation to follow due process to actually say ensure that they don't wrongfully disconnect someone's number and make them, in essence, a digital nobody, to cut them off from everything, from their banking, from their messaging, from communications, from everything requiring their current phone number. And given that so many things are linked to our phone number, including Aadhaar, it can completely cut you off and make you a non-citizen in effect. But there is no obligation on the government to exercise this properly that has been placed in these rules. There is no obligation to let you know, to give you a chance to say, hey, wait a second, I'm not a fraudster. Don't disconnect my number. There's no obligation to provide you notice, no obligation to hear your side before passing this order, and so on. The only obligations are placed on the telecom entity. So even when there's something good that I think is actually beneficial to curb fraud, that isn't um, that isn't expressed properly with proper legal safeguards in these amendments. There are other things which are of concern, all of which have to do with the idea of fraud and so on. Some of which more broadly, not restricted to frauds, but to cybersecurity more generally. Most of the more general provisions, I think, that is the provisions which have been introduced in the 2024 rules and the amended 2025 rules, I think are broadly along the right lines. They, for instance, require that there be a chief telecom security officer, that security incidents be that the government be notified about security incidents within a short span of time, and transparency obligations like that. And so on those, I think transparency obligations of these kinds are useful. But again, it's the government imposing these kinds of transparency obligations on telecom entities without itself having been transparent about huge amounts of security incidents, which have affected the NIC and core government, including the Indian Navy, Indian Army, and so on, and their secret data. It hasn't been transparent about any of these things which have happened over the last 15 years. and it just goes on imposing obligations on others without any clarity on how the government itself is going to use this information, what it's actually going to, how it's actually going to use it to make security better. So while these obligations are welcome, there has to be some clarity on how the government is going to use them and improve them, and how transparent the government itself is going to be with these. There's no clarity on that. Nothing is stated in the rules about that. There are concerns around something like the mobile number validation platform that the government has brought within these 2025 rules. Now, this is a centralized, quote unquote, decentralized model for validation of phone numbers that the government seeks to roll out, and it has given itself the power to make it mandatory. It already is mandatory for the telecom entities, but it might become mandatory for specific TUIs as well. Now, this platform has there are all kinds of issues. So this is a platform for entities to easily verify that your identity matches with a particular phone number. In theory, it's a good thing. It could be a good thing. There is an API in that GSM is testing out called Camara, which also does something similar. So in theory, it could make this entire thing of OTPs, etc., a bit less frequent. You'd only need to use it you won't need to use it for everything. There might be certain things for which identity verification, phone number verification can be done without OTPs. So that's, in theory, not a bad thing. However, there is no proposal to make this transparent. So people can query your identity without you ever finding out about it. At least with Aadhaar, there's a log that's kept, and you receive SMSs with this MNV. There's no proposal even for that. There's no transparency at all. Who has checked my identity? You can't find out. So, and this may be mandated. So again, you see the similar pattern. There being a lack of transparency at the end of the government, and there being obligations at the end of telecom entities and others, which may compromise the privacy of citizens. So there are all these kinds of changes. There's a blurring of jurisdiction. The Department of Telecom has suddenly gotten jurisdiction over a wide array of entities only because they use your phone number, which is ridiculous. So it's not core telecom, and yet it has granted itself that jurisdiction, and this is through the rules under the the new Telecom Act passed in 2023. So given all of that, there's a lot of concern. There are some steps in the positive direction, but without any kind of legal protections to protect us from the government, or any legal obligations on the government to be transparent. And that, I think, is where a lot of the problems stem from. That mindset, I think, which is well reflected in the rules, is where a lot of the problems stem from.
And the CEIR portal, if I'm not mistaken, right? It was sort of a joint initiative with the MHA. Even though it's Department of Telecom, in all of this, what we are looking at, we don't see the role of the MHA, the police, right? Like when we talk of querying that people can do, it's usually the police and the intel agencies. And the obligations on them are pretty much nil, right? Like you don't know what they're doing, you don't know how they're using it, which is what makes this concerning. I mean, the fun fact, when the ED, the Enforcement Directorate, went after the Delhi liquor case, they were actually demanding every politician to hand over every phone they ever had because they've installed a SIM in it. And CEIR is essentially that, right? It's a portal which is tracking all devices where you have put your SIM. And if you are now part of any investigations, I know a friend who is now being part of some domestic investigation, a very civil case, where his phone has been seized. And this idea of tracking how many phones you have the moment you put a SIM in it is really dangerous. On that note, I want to bring Rohini back and ask her about how these kind of ideas, this is not new, right? Like we've been seeing this happening a lot in the past. I mean, under different circumstances. When you talk of safety and security, women's safety kind of was the place since 2012, where we saw a lot of these kind of measures happening, where the state wanted to make mandatory panic buttons on your phone mandatory. Like this is like, I would say, the version 2.0 of some of that was happening in 2012, 2014. Rohini, do you have any reflections on that, on how these kind of measures, did they work when they were brought to women's safety? Do you see any parallels? Do you see, is there any chance some of it will restore issues?
Women's safety is repeatedly invoked in support of tighter identity controls and surveillance. And that did step on after the Nirbhaya incident that happened in Delhi and the Justice Verma committee report. And the framing of all of the measures that have been brought in the name of women's safety need a lot of scrutiny. The Safe City project, for example, was it's funded by the Nirbhaya Fund and was expressly brought in to improve women's safety in response to the findings and recommendations of the Justice Verma committee report. Now, just to give you a little, information about this example, it's has been operational since around 2018 in about 8 cities in India. And its tagline is "Stop crime before it happens." Now, I am not a lawyer, but what I understand of the legal system is that you are innocent until proven guilty. Also, zero consultation with women's groups, with women, since this was a women's safety initiative. No consultation with anyone. I mean, there's no public record of any consultation with anyone. But if this is a women's safety initiative primarily, who was consulted and who asked for it? I mean, I keep going back to this question: who asked for it? Where is the demand? Uh, what is the demand is to which this is a supply? Uh, so we see this pattern of even 66A had one of the justifications was that it is meant to address harassment of women, and it has a wider ambit because disparaging remarks can bring in those kind of communications which are not otherwise covered by uh, the other standards applicable of behavior on platforms, etc. Uh, the without any consultation with women, it's the entire approach of this fails.
Uh, I also want to ask you this, right? I mean, beyond women's safety, I mean, when you look at VPN rules and the kind of regulations that have come to not allow, let's say, uh, uh, imagery that's non-consensual imagery online. The Department of Telecom has been pretty much killing VPNs, and the argument can't allow people to access pornography, for example, and issues related to women's safety is being used as an excuse to control some of these as well. Do you want to comment more on that? Yeah.
So these measures, unfortunately, I see them harming survivors and harming women at risks more than helping. So they assume more traceability equals more safety, which is not how it works. So anonymity, device sharing, changing numbers is often a safety strategy, and continuous authentication and identifier validation can expose people at risk, survivors of abuse and violence, people trying to flee abuse and violence, sex workers and similar professions that need to keep their identities compartmentalized and use multiple SIM cards, tracking by abusers, families, institutions. So there are increased risks for survivors, and there has been no disaggregated impact assessment of these rules apart from, I mean, gender disaggregated impact assessment. No consultations with women, and an analysis of how identifier-centric systems have previously harmed women. So invoking women's safety without any such analysis risks instrumentalizing it to legitimate broader surveillance expansion. On the other hand, things that are not related to a lack of identifier, like the failures, safety related failures that are not related to a lack of identifier are underreporting, poor police response, low prosecution and conviction rates, and victim blaming and procedure barriers. Um, so that's not linked to any of this, what's written in this policy. So binding every communication more tightly to a telecom identity does not address these systemic failures.
Okay, so I guess we have 10 more minutes before we get into question Q&A. Is there anything that both of you want to talk about? I mean, I can ask more questions, but is there something that you want to present for 5 minutes each? Please go ahead. Yeah.
Rohini, would you like to go first? Okay, that
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry. Um, yeah, so I'd like to say that, Pranesh has covered this before, but what I see this is that telecom identifiers become de facto national identifiers, and that is a huge structural shift that without us having any of the safeguards, or without us having a say in this shift. So telecom identifiers were designed for routing communications, not for persistent identity verifications across the whole digital economy, and that creates the mobile number becoming the universal key, and TUIs being effectively being conscripted into a state mandated verification and monitoring system, without any system of checks and balances. Even when the telecom identifiers are incidental to their services, this creates horizontal surveillance across platforms and vertical surveillance, which is state access layered across atop private data collection without any statutory safeguards, statutory firewall separating the two.
Anything from you, Pranesh?
sure. Just one thing that I some of this that is coming from the government is not the result of trying to expand surveillance powers, but rather just a bad framework of thinking about state power. So and I realize this may be a bit controversial to say, and I realize people will disagree with me, but I genuinely do feel that that some of what we've seen is just due to bad policy making. For example, in sancharsaathi, uh, why do I not consider it spyware? Well, because it is largely useless. It's largely not very useful. If it was useful, for example, if mandating sancharsaathi to be pre-installed resulted in, say, if there's a phone which has been registered as stolen, suddenly not being able to be operated anymore, okay, then I would consider it spyware. But sancharsaathi can't do that. If sancharsaathi, the app itself, were to notify the police about a particular device with about location and so on without your permission, then I would consider it spyware, but it can't do that. So essentially, it's a useless. I mean, it's useful in that it facilitates things you could do online through the web more easily, but it's not really useful as a pre-installed app. It's just as useful if it's installed by the user. So it doesn't have superpowers. If it did have superpowers, it would be spyware because it could do various kinds of things without the user's control, without their knowledge. Now, what is actually operative when you're using something like sancharsaathi are things like the police complaint that you make when you lose your phone, because that is required to lodge your phone as lost on the platform. So it's that police complaint which becomes useful. And it separately, it is the EIRs, which I had mentioned. These are the databases which allow for blacklisting of phones, which allow for your stolen phone not to be resold within India, and these can actually be made interoperable globally. So if countries cooperate, then it cannot be resold outside of India as well. But there is a particular concern about stolen phones being bought by people, unsuspecting people, as second-hand phones and so on. So there is that concern. So it's actually these things at the telecom level which enable this, which is, I think, a useful thing, but which I think are without adequate safeguards in the law, as I'd mentioned earlier. I don't want to go through that again. But that is what is actually useful. That is actually what has these superpowers to block you and so on. It's not sancharsaathi. So it being made mandatory was not the case of the government seeking surveillance powers. Now, it's a slightly different situation with VPNs. For example, VPNs, blocking of VPNs is, I think, being used for censorship. Now, you can view censorship positively as speech regulation, or you could view it negatively as quote unquote censorship. For example, recently, there have been two platforms, two instances just in the last 15 days or just last month or so, where a large quantity of personal private data, including in some cases location data attached to phone numbers, in some cases Aadhaar numbers, etc., were apparently leaked. It's not clear from what databases these have been collated, whether it's a single database, etc. But there's been a huge leak. It's a and there has to be some involvement of a telecom company or the government because the data seems to have come from something like that. What is the government's response? Rather than looking at investigating this and trying to go after the people who had either weak security or who participated in the leak and so on, they are going after VPNs. They are going after software that allows you to pretend to have a different IP. Okay. They're going after VPNs and telling them that they are under an obligation. These VPN software and service providers are under an obligation to block access to these websites and to these services which are leaking data. That's ridiculous. The government should directly be trying to figure out how to get rid of this data being available. Rather, they're trying to go after security tools, VPNs, to do their dirty work in a way that actually isn't, in my opinion, legal, that actually isn't even effective, because you can access these even without using VPNs. You can access them directly. You can access them through onion routing tools like Tor, etc., which are more sophisticated than VPNs and harder to block. So it's quite ridiculous. So and of course, all of this sits within a framework of unbounded censorship in many cases, unaccountable government, where they can use things like they can install spyware on people's phones without having, with the Supreme Court not holding them to account, with the opposition not being able to hold them to account in Parliament, and so on. So we've had all these kinds of situations where there are problems with surveillance, there are problems with censorship, but I still feel that every single provision of the law should be looked at individually to see whether it stems from a place of censorship or surveillance. And in some cases they don't. Some cases they're positive things, but they're more negatives, I would say, than positive in the changes we've seen in the last 2 years since the 2023 Telecom Act.
I mean, I have been sorry, I have been constantly disagreeing with you on that part. While I don't think sancharsaathi is spyware, but if you look that with SIM binding, with CIER, and what the other intel agencies have been doing with IMEI data, the ecosystem becomes a more of a controlled surveillance setup, and which is where my disagreement stems from with you on this. But yes, I agree with you on a lot of these, that it's also bad policy. They really haven't thought through on how this might affect travelers who are traveling abroad, especially a lot of NRIs who may want to retain Indian accounts while they're abroad, which is something that Nikhil Pava has been talking a lot about. And
even people who are just accessing Signal or WhatsApp on their laptops, now they have to connect it to their phones every 6 hours mandatorily. It doesn't make any sense. And the worst part is the scamsters operating from Myanmar and Cambodia. they have sophisticated automation scripts that will just automate this. So this won't affect them at all because they're already doing precisely this, and they just need to change the script a little bit better. They can automate this using computer programs, which you and I can't. We have to struggle, and so it's quite sad that the how the government thinks about this, as Rohini mentioned, that it doesn't have properly thought out threat models, which is the technical jargon they use in security field. They haven't actually scoped out the threat model. They haven't seen how this regulation will either help or not help, and so on. They just feel, oh, it's more secure if it is bound to an identity like the SIM, and so we are going to do this. No, you have huge amounts of fraud in UPI, right? It's not as though fraud isn't happening in UPI because it is bound to the SIM. It's not as though fraud isn't happening with SMSs because it is bound to the SIM. You need to think about your models, and in fact, it's easier to tackle fraud on things like Signal and WhatsApp, etc., which give you a notification if someone who isn't part of your contacts is trying to contact you, which allow you to block people more easily, and so on. Like, it just doesn't make sense to make all of these as insecure as the UPI ecosystem, where humongous amounts of fraud are taking place, or the SMS ecosystem. It just does not make any sense.
I think it's an important point that you're also trying to make, right? Like within the government's framework, within government's lens, pushing identity solves fraud. And this is the kind of argument that they brought with Aadhaar. Like, oh, ID is being brought to do deduplication, so no more fraud anywhere, right? And it's stuck in a lot of government officials' head that Aadhaar did solve all fraud in India, which it didn't. And there is a reluctance to accept there is a fraud. It's just that it's easier for them to now say there is no more fraud because we brought Aadhaar, right? So it's within the question of narratives. It's they have the narrative that ID means no fraud, and they're bringing ID everywhere.
So let's look at this, right? With UPI, where very many people in the audience, and I personally know people who've been victims of fraud with the UPI ecosystem. Now there, your bank account is linked to an ID necessarily. Your bank account, and then your phone number is linked to an ID necessarily under Indian laws. Then your phone number is also linked to your bank account, both independently and whenever you're using UPI. It's linked. There are all these multiple levels of ID and KYC, and yet we find that has not tackled the fundamental problems of being able to forget about prevent fraud, okay, but even trace fraud and to hold the fraudsters accountable post facto. Even that doesn't adequately happen in India because of the legal system, because there are all kinds of problems in actually doing this. So just making sure an identity is associated at every stage does not help prevent fraud, or even forget about preventing, or even holding fraud to account post facto. It doesn't actually ensure that. And so we must question the fundamentals of how the government thinks about KYC and identity.
I think let's open to questions now. We got 10 minutes. If you're watching it live and you have questions, please post your comments and questions. We'll try to answer them. Maybe we have a bunch already. Let's see. We can go with questions in the order that we had. There's Anushka K. She has a question. How do we draw the line between protection and surveillance? Any of you, Rohini, Pranesh? That's a very broad question, but do you want to address that? Like, where does cybersecurity?
I think it's. This. it needs to be proportionate. What are you trying to protect? Needs to be proportionate. So something I heard from our old colleague where Pranesh and I used to work, Sunil Abraham, he used to say that surveillance should be like salt in the food. Some amount is necessary, but too much of it and it'll poison the food. So I think that's the right measure. If you're going to measure it out, that's the right measure. Yeah. Also, protection, because a lot of this is specifically women's safety. Please ask women first.
Then we
Now,
have. Oh, you wanna address that too?
we could perhaps get some more questions in, and then I could address this as well while addressing the next. So it's better to have more
There's one
questions in.
question on judiciary that you may want to address by Amit Biswas. He says there's a silence of judiciary in cases of Pegasus behind the wall of national security, which raises certain questions. You've been trying to talk about the role of courts in all of this, right? Like in case of frauds. Now, in the Supreme Court, I believe the Supreme Court is asking government questions on all of these digital arrest cases. Can you just give a kind of analysis of how the courts have worked or not worked in case of digital issues?
So firstly, I think um, broadly courts in India, the higher judiciary in India, just like the executive and parliament, they try to take on a lot of power to themselves. So the Supreme Court and high courts, they've just expanded their jurisdiction all the time. They keep trampling into areas, policy areas, which are the domain of the executive and the legislature all the time. So I think there is a problem in expecting the judiciary to fix all these, the digital arrest discussions, etc. I think kind of highlights this problem. The court doesn't know what the right things to do are, and yet it often passes orders telling the government to do this and that, which in very many cases it passes these orders without thinking about civil liberties. So it's not as though the courts are the safe are these guardians of civil liberties and protect us from excessive state power. That's it's very often the courts deploying excessive state power, often requiring other branches of the state, like the executive, to block websites, to engage in further surveillance, and so on. So firstly, there's a problem in how the judiciary sees their role in very many cases as well. Secondly, the judiciary can also be too trusting of the executive, can allow for all kinds of claims to be made by the executive without actually verifying them. The Pegasus issue is a great example of that as well. So there are all these problems with how the judiciary defers to the executive on cases of national security and so on, even without actually checking, was this a genuine case of national security, or were you just using it to spy on journalists and political opponents? Without even actually delving into the core of these issues, the judiciary defers to the executive and defers to these committees which it creates, which don't necessarily do a good job. Lastly, I'd point out that sorry, the previous question was on there was something I wanted to add.
It was, where do you draw the line between protection and surveillance?
Protection and surveillance, yes. Now, on that, including on questions of women's protection, I think there's it's not very easy because different people have different opinions. For example, there was the IDP, an organization that used to work in the space. They conducted research amongst garment workers in Karnataka, in Bangalore a long time ago, looking at CCTV cameras and their use. Now, many women workers were actually advocating for greater usage of CCTV cameras within the workspace because they felt more protected. And that's what now the researchers, they didn't agree with those interviewees who said we actually welcome this, but the researchers were anti-surveillance and so on. But that's just to point out that there is no uniformity of views on questions like CCTV, on what the line is between protection and surveillance. What I can add is whenever we're thinking about using surveillance for greater protection, we have to remember that uh, that we shouldn't put the cart before the horse. That what we are demanding, what we're looking for is protection. What we're looking for is security, and surveillance in a limited amount is only a means to achieve that. So, and what I mean by that, to elaborate, is that we have to have safeguards at all levels when it comes to security and when it comes to surveillance. If we don't provide for transparency along with surveillance, if we don't provide for due process along with surveillance, if we don't allow for contestability by citizens and notification to citizens and consumers along with surveillance, then we are denuding ourselves of not just rights, but of protection, because then the power that we grant to the government becomes unaccountable. And so accountability has got to be there as a protection against excessive surveillance. And it's only when we have proper accountability as well that we can actually use surveillance for protection rather than for abuse.
So there are a few more. I think I'm going to take one, which is, how do you see upcoming scenarios, and are there any mitigation steps that one could take up to redress these issues? Let's say the government's doing all of this. You're being forced to do KYC, you're being forced to give away your data. What is it that you can do? I mean, legal and technical. Rohini, do you want to step in here? Oh, did she leave the chat?
No,
No, you're
yeah,
here. Right.
yeah. I mentioned a few scenarios while I was speaking, and those were mainly how people at risk, people who are already at risk, or people who were marginalized would be affected. Mitigation steps. Technical ones for things like sim binding, they need the platforms to uh, make certain changes in their design and architecture, um, uh, like offering a temporary dual number grace window, etc. Um, uh, yeah. But given like the speed of response, I'm not sure how effective those would be. And given the fact that many platforms have downsized or laid off their trusted safety teams.
What I've been trying to do is, I have different devices with no SIMs in it. I mean, like, when the government and the state is trying to kind of bind everything to SIM, the best thing potentially to do is not to have a SIM. I mean, it's not like you can work without SIM, but it's just that how do you have alternates? Can you get a SIM from a different country? I mean, you don't have to have the SIM, but can you create accounts based on it? Can you have alternatives which don't use phone numbers? Can there, I think Signal's now saying they're going to allow emails. Yeah, so uh, platforms are also going to change because they see this as a risk profile now. I guess a lot of that will evolve as well. But my advice: don't ever put a SIM on a phone that you don't want the state to know that it exists. Uh, like And if you're putting a SIM in it, in fact, I would say get one of those tiny dongles, the Airtel or the Geo dongles, put a SIM in it, and use Wi-Fi. It's just that when the state wants it, give away the dongle. The dongle has nothing in it. It's just a dongle, right? Like there's no phone, there's no apps, nothing. But yeah, maybe we have a couple of closing comments that can happen if there is time. We're at 12 right now, but we can wrap up. If there is any closing comments either of you want to make, quickly, very quickly, 1 minute, and then we'll close.
Very quickly, I think public advocacy does work to an extent. We saw with the rollback of sancharsaathi, which again is the reason I don't think it was surveillance, because they wouldn't roll back surveillance as easily. But public advocacy does work to an extent, and filing cases does also help to an extent. For public advocacy, amplify voices of people like Srinivas and Rohini, who publicly write about these issues and tweet about them and so on. I think the last thing I'll say is I find it really funny that amongst the obligations that the government has put are that TUIs must follow Data Protection Act very carefully as well. That's also there in the cybersecurity. So on the one hand, they're telling them to violate data protection, and on the other hand, they're telling them to take it very seriously and to take consent for everything, and so on. So the government seems to have very mixed messaging. We need the broader fix for this, of course, is proper both proper policy pre-consultation, some of which has been included in the rules by mandating discussions with TRI, and so on. But proper white paper, green paper system, which allows for public feedback, which allows then the government to come back and say not just that they're doing this and provide the rules, but to also requires them to say why they decided to do A rather than B, why they decided to have the trade-off between privacy and surveillance at a particular spot and so on. So requiring reasons from the government as to why they chose particular trade-offs, I think is should be part of the advocacy that we engage in.
Rohini, do you want to have any final
Yes.
one?
I'd like to see clear evidence of causal effectiveness of all of these measures. As far as I know, there's no publicly available evidence demonstrating, centralized mobile number validation platforms will reduce fraud conviction rates. SIM-based continuous authentication leads to better attribution of crimes. And that IMEI controls materially improve prosecution outcomes rather than merely enabling blacklisting. So fraud prevention here is being asserted, it's not being demonstrated. And in the absence of transparent metrics, like the reason that Pranesh was talking about, the rules only become compliance mechanisms. They're not actually crime control.
Yeah. On that note, we are going to end this session. Thank you all for joining us. If there is anything, you can probably both write to Pranesh, Rohini, and they should be happy to reply if there are any further questions. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for